Welcome back, everyone. I've been trying quite a bit of parachute flies, and I've had a few requests on making a video on parachutes. It seems like quite a few guys have a little bit of trouble in getting the proportions right and to tie it off. That is seems to be the main thing, is tying it off, and it's actually not that difficult. Decided to make a video on this. Now, there are quite a few different materials that can be used for posts, and that material is quite important. I can remember about 25 years ago when I ran a commercial fly tying factory. We used to tie quite a number of parachute flies, and the posts back then were tied with calf tail. But a lot of synthetic materials became available, and we started substituting calf tail for synthetics, and that's happened. I mean, it wasn't our idea; it happened all over the world. And the most common, I think, at the moment is Antron yarn or a similar product. There are various which are actually the same, just called different things. There's Antron yarn, there's poly yarn, there's a floating poly yarn, which is pre-treated. They're very similar, but they may have different properties. And I quite like to use just plain Antron yarn, and that is what I'm going to use now. Now, I've tied a lot of posts with CDC as well, so I will include a little bit on the CDC. But I'm going to start with Antron yarn, and first of all, the area, where do you tie the post in? Where's the right? How far from the eye of the hook? How far? How much space do you have to leave between the eye of the hook and the post? Those sort of things are what I found from talking to some tyres are a little bit. There's a lot of uncertainty about that. Now, I've got a general sort of rule, and what I do is when I tie a mayfly imitation in parachute style, which would be like a parachute Adams or parachute BWO or any of those sort of patterns, then I tied 25% of the hook shank behind the eye of the hook. That is my sort of rule of thumb that I use, and that gives you a very good idea of proportion. And I tie the tail in normally, and then I go back and I tie the parachute, and then I finish the abdomen. Because as soon as you tie the post, as soon as you tie the post in, you've got a very good idea of proportion on that fly as well. So what I've done here is I've already covered part of the hook shank. I'm not going to cover the whole hook shank to tie a fly. I'm just going to do the parachute. And my thread is in the same place where I want to tie the post. So what I do is you take about an inch or inch and a half of Antron yarn. I'm going to use bright color so you can see the difference between the material and the thread that I'm using. Take that piece and I'll let the thread hang and fold that around the thread, and just grab it between your thumb and forefinger on your material hand. You lift the bobbin up so the thread is the bobbin is above the thread. Slide the bobbin is above the hook. Slide the Antron down and complete the wrap, and you'll have the Antron trapped on top of the hook. I always make a second wrap just to make sure it will not come out, and then you have that. What you do next is to grab both ends and swing them so that they are perpendicular to the hook shank. They're not going to stay there. You're going to have to trap them with a few wraps. And you grab the one end and just make a wrap in the opposite direction. So in other words, you do like a figure of 8 figure of 8 thread wraps around over the antron, but don't do too many because you can bulk this thing up very quickly. What you do, I normally do 2 wraps. So there's the second wrap, and then you have that, which is similar to spinner wings, and you can see how thin the thread wraps are. How there's no bulk or anything there that can be in the way. Last thing what I do before I lift those 2 ends and tie them together is to make one more wrap behind the antron, just to make sure that when you put tension on the thread, that tension goes into the hook shank and not directly onto the antron. If you don't do that, then you're going to pull the antron out of position. Next thing is to lift those 2 ends of the antron, bring them together between your thumb and forefinger on your tying hand, and then start to wrap around them, over the hook shank and around the antron. And it's going to take 3 or 4 wraps to get those 2 pieces of antron together. Just make sure those wraps are on top of each other, not overlapping, and not too much space between them. Just 2 or 3 wraps like that, just to keep that in place. We're gonna go back and stiffen that up a little bit more a little bit later. At this point, you need to tie the hackle in. So you're going to take your thread forward and leave it right there. Now, selecting the right hackle is, and I use the genetic saddles, which are, they're not tapered like capes, the hackle from capes. They are long, it's easy to work with, very thin and flexible stems. And you clear a little bit of the stem. Now that section that you clear there is about double the length between the eye of the hook and the post. That is what you want to clear. Now you tie that in on top of the hook, and you take your thread, just get that start slipping, tie that in right there in front of the hook or front of the post behind the eye, and make sure your wraps are next to each other and they don't overlap, all the way back to the stem, to there, and another wrap behind the post. Now the hackle, I'm just going to grab another one here and just to show you. The hackle have a shiny side and a more of a dull side. There's the inside, the dull side, and there's the shinier side. Now the dull side is the inside of the hackle. That's the side you don't see when you look at a bird. And you want the dull side, when you tie it in, to be against the hook shank, facing the hook shank, and you tie it in like that. Now we're at the point where we're going to lift it up and finish the post and make sure that hackle is tied in properly. So when you lift it up, the dull side must be against the post of the post that you're tying in. And then you're going to carry on with those wraps around, but you're going to tie the hackle in against that post at the same time, and make sure those wraps are on top of each other, one above the other, so they don't overlap. You don't want, you want an even surface to wrap that hackle down when it comes to wrapping the hackle. And you just go around, and you go up as the same distance as the distance between the hook eye and the post. That is what I normally use as measurements. And once you're up there, you're going to come down with your wraps and the thread should naturally be on the hook bend side of the post, but that's not where you want it. You want it to be on this side. But we're first going to put dubbing on, so you leave it there, and we're going to dub this. I'm just going to use a grey dubbing. This is like an Antron dubbing, which is what I normally use for the thoraxes when I tie parachute flies. It's a very nice fine little dubbing, but you can use trilobal, use many dubbings. Dub the thread lightly and build that thorax up. I normally do it behind the post first, and then I go to the front. I've seen guys who prefer to do it in front first and then go move backwards. But it's a personal preference. I don't think it's going to make you catch more fish if you do it the other way around, or make you catch less fish. And then you go to the front, you taper that a little bit down to the front, depending on the fly you tie obviously, and you go against the post as well. One behind the post, one in front of the post, and you leave your thread in front of the post. Now I very lightly dub this. I normally make a slightly bulkier thorax. The hackle will, if you're a right-hand tire and you tie this in there facing the post, you need to wrap this hackle counterclockwise around the post. If you are a left-hand tire, you need to wrap this hackle clockwise around the post. Reason for that is, if I wrap this counterclockwise, I'm a right-hand tire, so I need to wrap it counterclockwise. The hackle will turn with the dull side facing up, which is what you want, because all the fibers on the hackle have a natural curve, and you want them to curve slightly upwards, and that helps you a lot when it comes to tying the fly off. So I'm going to grab that hackle, start to wrap it counterclockwise. If you're a right-hand tire, if you're a left-hand tire, you can wrap it clockwise, and one wrap below the other. And you can see it turned with a dull side up, and they have that natural curve slightly upwards. And you make all the wraps against each other, one below the other, to about there, until you get to the thorax. Now at this point you need the hackle to point towards you, to be on your side of the hook, the piece that you're going to cut off. And you've wrapped it counterclockwise. What you need to do now is to bring the hackle down, pull it down, lift your thread up, which will face away from you on the other far side of the hook, and make a wrap counterclockwise under the parachute, around the post and over the hackle. So you trap that hackle in against the parachute, and you make about 3 wraps there, firm wraps, and you stop your thread on the right hand side right there, and that hackle can now be cut off, that excess. And I'm going to cut that off, and you can see the parachute. There's no, after you tied it off in, there's no fibers that are trapped, unnecessarily trapped. Sometimes you do trap a fiber or two and you can just cut them out, but you can see it's very neat. It stays neat. There's no unnecessary trapped fibers. In fact, I think I did trap a fiber or two there. Just cut those out, and you can see the parachute sitting very nicely there. Now to tie that off, you take the thread, and remember I'm using different colors, so I'm not using a grey thread to match the dubbing. and I don't use a work finishing tool, I use my hands, and I can even with my fingers get in there and tie that off right there. And it's very important that you go around the right way around the hook, around the post when you tie these parachutes. That makes life a lot easier. I've seen guys going around the one way, the thread goes the other way, and it's just too difficult to tie it off. If you can manage that and manage to get the hackle going around the one way and the thread going around the same way, then you'll see how easy it is actually to tie this. So do it in the same sequence as I did it here. Go and give it a try and leave a comment. Tell me whether it works for you or not. And then I always cut the post a little bit shorter. And there's just a simple parachute that you can tie onto a fly. Now, just while we on the subject of parachutes and hackle, I've also been asked about what size hackle do you use. I've seen guys using big hackles, I've seen guys using very small hackles on parachutes. I mean, it's absolutely a personal preference, but my suggestion is get a hackle gauge and gauge your hackle. If you use a size 16 hook, use a size 16 hackle on that hook. Because of with a parachute, if you tie the parachute or the post in the right place and your hackle is wrapped around, then it should end at the base of the tail, which will be around there. It should end. Then that's when I know that my proportions are right on the dry flies, on the parachute flies at least. Where the tail comes out and where the abdomen starts at the back, if my hackle tips meet that point, then I know my hackle is the right size on that hook. It's just another reference point. It's another thing that I use. You can use smaller hackle, you can use a bigger hackle, but that's the way I like to do it. Now, let's have a quick look at, I'm going to put another hook in here, at tying a CDC post. And CDC posts are also very, very nice to use if you want a little bit of a more a bulkier post. And for that I use marcpetitjean's CDC Clamps, and I'm going to put thread on this real quickly and get the thread in the right position. I'll show you I'm going to thread it a little bit further up there. I'll show you the way I tie it with the clamps. Now if I can grab the clamps, I'm not going to have the clamps on the camera unfortunately. All the instructions are in the CDC clamped packaging, and there are a ton of videos. In fact, I'll link one of marcpetitjean's videos to this. Then you can go and have a look at the how to get the CDC in the clamps and how to use the clamps. They are very handy tools. I take 3 CDC feathers. You can never put enough CDC in a fly. Put them in the clamp, and I quite like to use the long CDC. I'm a wing shooter, so I do a lot of wing shooting and waterfowl and so on. I very often harvest the CDC, especially if you shoot spur wings or Egyptian geese or all those sort of birds. They have beautiful CDC, and I always harvest the goose bites as well. Now I've got I'm using about 3 CDC feathers here in the clamp. I'm going to cut them off, and then he created some really nice tools to work with CDC and get CDC together, and great posts. So what you have at the end is that little clump of CDC. Now this is maybe too much for a size 16 hook, but you grab that clump and you tie it in pointing forward. With firm wraps, make sure it stays on top of the hook. But you can see, and this is the same issue we had with calf tail posts, is that you've got the bulk sitting on top of the hook. So your thorax or your abdomens are always going to be a little bit thicker and bulkier when you tie CDC, a CDC post or any other material than yarn that you can fold around the thread. It is going to bulk up that abdomen area and make it a little bit more tricky to tie a thin-bodied fly. Close that in with a layer of thread. Take your thread back, and generally you would have tied the tail in by now before you even started the CDC. You take that CDC, you fold it up, and you make a few wraps in front to push that CDC up. And it's always tricky to get that CDC to stand 100% upright. And at this point you take your thread back behind the post again, lift the CDC and start to wrap around. About there. I'm going to tie a hackle in as well, just to show you what that parachute looks like. Again, remember the dull side towards the hook shank when you tie it in. Take the thread to the behind the post, then start to wrap that hackle around, or the thread, and tie the hackle in against the post. Then come down with the thread. But now you've got quite a bulky area behind the post, and you've still got to put dubbing on there. So that is why everything that you do here is very important. It's got to be very sparse. That dubbing must be really sparse. Dub the thread, very thin, light layer of dubbing on the thread. Not going to be very clear, to be honest with you, but we'll do it anyway. There we go. And in front, thread is definitely, the bright thread is definitely shining through the dubbing, but what I always do is to match the right color when I actually get to tying the fly. So when I tie a Adams parachute, or parachute Adams, or any Adams, I would tie it with a grey thread, although I've seen a lot of guys tying it with black. There's nothing wrong with that either. And you stop your thread in the front of in front of the post. The next step is to grab that feather and you run that around counterclockwise all the way down. You'll see as soon as you start to wrap that feather, it turns with the dull side up, which is what you want, because you want those barbs to point up. You'll see they've got a natural curve upwards, and you want them to point upwards, or curve upwards rather. And you just keep on wrapping that all the way until you get down to the dubbing thorax, and you stop there. Now you'll see that that parachute, the hackle, is quite neat. It's nice and point out. It doesn't point up or down, or it's not a mess. And then to tie it off, you pull the hackle down. The hackle will be pointing towards you now, with a thread on the eye side of the hook of the post, and hanging on the far side of the hook shank. So you're going to take that hackle, pull that down, lift the thread up horizontal with in a horizontal position, and wind it in the same direction that you wound the hackle. And you're going to go around the post and over the hackle to trap that hackle against the post. Now remember, when you're a right-hand tire like me, you wind the hackle counterclockwise. When you're a left-hand tire, you could wind it clockwise. And that is why you tie it in with the hackle facing the dull side, facing the post, so that when you start to wind it, it will turn with the dull side up. And then you tie that off. Make sure you don't trap any of those hackle fibers. Go in underneath them. Very easy to tie them off. 3 or 4 wraps there, and then you can cut that. Let the thread hang, and you cut that hackle away. You then grab the thread and tie it off in the front, right there, and you'll see that hackle is pointing slightly upwards, slightly away from the hook shank and the hook eye, and that helps you to get in there and finish that off and cut the thread very nicely. I don't use a whip finishing tool. I just use my fingers. So you can get in there very nicely and cut that, make that whip finish and cut that off. And then the last step with a CDC post is to cut that CDC, to trim that shorter. And you grab that, pull it closer, pull all those fibers together and cut it. And don't cut it too short. You'll see it opens up very nicely. It's a very nice effect that you get on the post. Get that splits off there. You can see it opens up very nicely. It shows a slightly more prominent wing on when you tie a CDC post rather than an Antron yarn post, or even a calf tail post, because it puffs out a little bit. So it shows a slightly bulkier fly, and that is the CDC post on a parachute. I've shown you 2 techniques now, or 2 materials to tie posts now. Go and use them. I'll definitely link a video to marcpetitjean's CDC clamps. They are very handy tools. I use them very often for various techniques and flies. Please subscribe to the channel. Please like the video. Please comment if you have other ways of doing this. I'd love to know about them, and let me know how it goes. Thanks for watching.